We have all heard of the American Civil War. At least I hope we have. We all know how the story transpires. The North, under the leadership of President Lincoln, won the good war, stifled the South, and freed the slaves. But what would have happened if instead Lincoln lost and the South prevailed? Today, I want to take a look at the alternate timeline and see where the country would be. I'll be focusing primarily on the immediate aftermath, slavery, and civil rights, and how that would affect us today. Immediate aftermath. Reconstruction is a term used to describe Northern occupation of the South and the harsh, albeit deserved, treatment of Southern rebels, as well as actually reconstructing all the things lost in the war and the rise and fall of the radical Republicans. It officially started with the Reconstruction Act of 1867. In our timeline, Lincoln wanted to mend the wounds of the war seamlessly and try to put the conflict behind us. But how would the South have responded had they won? I would think the first thing they would do is reverse the famous Emancipation Proclamation. It should come to no surprise that the South wanted to keep the institution of slavery. And contrary to what you've heard, yes, that is why the South fought the Civil War. They wanted to keep slavery and fought to do so. It is undeniable. The new president of the South, or now the United States, presumably Jefferson Davis, would enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and bring back all the wartime runaway slaves. They would draft a new constitution very similar to our own, but would place slavery as a new amendment. Or they would have created their own 13th Amendment, one that would solidify slavery forever. It goes without saying that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would have never hit the floor of the new legislature, at least for some time to come. I briefly touched on slavery in the last point, but I do think that with enough social pressure and the Second Industrial Revolution shortly ahead, that slavery would have eventually ended in the New South victory timeline as well. The increase in transportation and the American economy moving away from agriculture more and more, as well as the invention of electricity, machines, rail, steel, and iron manufacturing and production. I do think around this time slavery wouldn't be seen as a necessary institution anymore. I think racism and the idea of supremacy would continue, but slavery likely will be abolished and slave owners will be, quote, reimbursed for their, quote, hardship, in all likelihood. It would be unlikely that the KKK would have ever been formed, considering they were a reaction to the South losing and a product of white supremacist ideas and the Lost Cause movement. My last main talking point is civil rights. For the purpose of this section, I will assume that slavery was abolished sometime between 1900 and the start of World War One. I don't think it would have went on that long. So now that the slaves are freed, how are they perceived? They would not be considered equal socially or economically. Jim Crow is a huge factor in this timeline, and without the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, there isn't really a way out. They would replace slavery with low wages, even lower than the others in the lower class, long hours, and no standards for workplace safety. With the introduction of the minimum wage in 1938, I believe that would probably still happen, but there'd be a minimum wage for whites and a minimum wage for people of color. Jim Crow would be far, far worse in this timeline, as if it wasn't bad enough in reality. Brown versus the Board, the famous case that stated separate but equal has no place in educational institutions, and they were, quote, inherently unequal and violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. But as I mentioned, the 14th Amendment wasn't passed if the South won, and the court wouldn't have had a constitutional crisis to consider. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 wouldn't have passed. Southern Democrats at the time, like Alabama Governor George Wallace, were popular with their constituents, and his now infamous, yeah, that speech is a great summary of the political ideologies of that era in the South. I might add that although he never won the presidency, he was extremely popular. And depending on how the South would have drafted the new Constitution, it would have been very possible that someone like him could have won in time so recent to our current day. If the South would have won, in summary, if the South would have won the Civil War, I believe the ramifications would have greatly affected our current day. It would have never allowed the Civil Rights Amendments to pass. Jim Crow may very well still be in full effect. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 wouldn't have passed. And I think contemporary racial issues would be far worse than they are now. I think slavery will be viewed as unnecessary still, but white supremacist ideas and laws would have passed, and civil rights wouldn't have passed when they did. People like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and other activists wouldn't have had their historic impact. If the South would have won, I think the civil rights movement may have happened very recently or could very well be transpiring today in 2024. Hank Williams Jr. once said, "If the South would have won, we'd have had it made." And I could not disagree more. Thankfully, the North won. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below. What historical topics would you like me to cover next? Until the next one, peace.